Okay, we're all set.
All right. Great. Thank you, everyone, so much for being with us today. A couple of items before we get started. If you haven't heard in the other presentations you've seen today, AERI is looking for people to fill steering committee positions, and nominations are open until July 16th. So please consider joining, and you can learn more about this opportunity via the links that my colleagues are pasting into the chat. Also, before we get started, we have a widely distributed group assembled here today. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the regions in which we undertake our work. The Pasquetto, 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞, and their Indigenous kin and neighbors on whose traditional territory the University of Maryland resides. As a land-grant university, I want to further acknowledge the 202,000 acres of Indigenous land distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. Pass it over to Mason.
Hi, I acknowledge the tribes of the Great Pee River, the Sherrall, Lumbee, and Pee on whose lands I live and work, and the history of colonialism and imperialism that has impacted their lands, communities, and histories.
I immigrated from Austria to Canada about 9 years ago, and it really took me a while to understand what it means that I'm a settler and that Canada is a settler colonial state. The land on which the University of Toronto operates and on which I work and live is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. They've been here for thousands of years, and today this land is still the home to many Indigenous peoples, and I'm grateful that I can work on it.
And we're using Zoom today, and Zoom's headquarters have been erected on the unceded land of the Muwekma-Ohlone tribal nation. We acknowledge the separation that these and other acts of colonialism and assimilation generated between Indigenous peoples and their homelands, as well as their knowledge held in archives, museums, and libraries. And we further acknowledge the continued power and resilience of Indigenous communities and nations, and the important contributions that Indigenous scholars and practitioners are making to the fields of information and archives. I'm kicking us off today by introducing the Recovering and Reusing Archival Data Lab, affectionately known here as the RAD Lab at the University of Maryland, College Park. We are several early career faculty members, PhD students, and master's students in library and information science, all working on multiple parallel and intersecting projects related to the themes you see depicted here on the screen: the opportunities of data recovery and reuse, what reusing data in different ways means for different communities and across a variety of contexts, including different disciplines, different communities, different types of data. Next slide, please. This is a subset of us gathered here today. At least one more of us is presenting right after this. Caitlin Christian Lamb presenting in the next AERI session on short papers. And we're very proud to be representing the work of this larger group of very serious and earnest collaborators. You can also see in the bottom left of the screen our mascot here at the overarching Center for Archival Futures, the terrapin surrounded by archival records and linked data. The Center for Archival Futures is a center here at the university dedicated to understanding the futures of archives and digital curation. And we host a speaker series every academic semester with some really fabulous speakers. So please check that out for the fall. Speakers yet to be announced. The goal of today's panel is to briefly introduce several RAD projects to share what we're doing in a set of not quite lightning talks, with the goal of sparking conversation in this community and inviting you all to contact us if any of these projects are relevant to you. I'll briefly articulate the themes we'll be speaking about, and then I'll be turning it over to 4 panelist presentations, followed by a response from Dr. Christoph Becker. All of our talks today are centered on the theme of communities recreating and repurposing archives and the data within those archives. As you can see, the communities we focus on, the disciplines and the methods we're using toward data recovery and reuse all vary, from the sciences to the humanities, from Indigenous communities to LGBTQ+ communities, and so on. Next slide, please. So I won't read through the talk titles, but at the end of our talks, we'll round them out with a response from our honored discussant, Dr. Christoph Becker, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Each of our panelists will have about 7 minutes to present, and then we'll use the remaining time in our session, both for our discussion led by Dr. Becker and for the audience Q&A. In the meantime, you're all strongly encouraged to post your questions and comments in the chat. We'll all contribute to moderating the chat, and we'll save especially juicy topics for our out loud Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. So we are delighted to have Dr. Becker with us today. Dr. Becker is an associate professor at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto and director of the Digital Curation Institute, which conducts research at the intersection of digital curation and systems design. His work is focused on the design of just and sustainable information technology. He's published widely in software systems, digital libraries, digital curation, created award-winning decision support tools for scalable digital preservation in collaboration with international consortia of universities, cultural heritage organizations, and commercial partners, and developed open methods to evaluate digital preservation processes and capabilities. His book, Insolvent: How to Reorient Computing for Just Sustainability, will appear in 2023 at MIT Press. We are so excited to have Dr. Becker offering our response today as he brings a cross-disciplinary perspective to problems that shoot through all of our projects, including expertise in sustainability and socio-technical systems design, and the impact of information systems on societies. All of that said, I think we are ready now to jump into our first panel presentation. I am the PI on the first projects we'll present, and our first presenters are Alia Reza and Amanda Sorensen, PhD students here at the UMD iSchool. And they'll be discussing two separate projects in a sort of dialogue. These are two different projects, different research questions, but both studying grassroots curation efforts for historical data. But in very different disciplinary contexts. So the first project is focused on the digital humanities and the second on the sciences. We thought it would be interesting to pose these projects in dialogue with one another, since at the heart, both are concerned with initiatives driven by different kinds of communities to recover historical data for different kinds of reuse. So in the slides that follow, we'll be showing examples of what we're uncovering in each of these projects in dialogue. And with that, I'll pass it off to Alia and Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Our first project is called Sustaining Digital Community Collections, and it looks across digital humanities scholarship and digital community archives to identify sustainability strategies that are centered in the communities that create and use those projects. This is a multi-case study of 4 DH projects, which has produced more than 40 interviews with project teams. We are currently completing cross-case analysis.
Within the Reusing Archival Data for Science project, we are interested in identifying what opportunities and challenges confront teams working to recover and reuse historical data for active scientific research. We have conducted 21 semi-structured interviews to date with scientists and curators. Our participants come from many different roles, organizations, and disciplines, including oceanography, paleontology, agriculture, and transportation. We are currently analyzing transcriptions through qualitative coding methods. These studies have produced extensive data and a rich set of preliminary findings specific to their different research questions. But in this presentation, we just want to highlight a couple of contrasting examples of what data rescue looks like across the context that we're studying, of what data recovery practices look like, and of common challenges that arise. So first, we will look at data reuse.
So the Lakeland Digital Archive uses community archive materials to document the history of the Lakeland community. The Lakeland project started as research for a single book, an effort by the community to document its own history and contributions to African American history in the wider region. But now, as it has grown into a fuller digital archive, the community is reusing the data for advocacy and to jumpstart a restorative justice initiative with the city. The enslaved.org project, as the name suggests, documents the stories of enslaved people throughout history. Using data collected from scholarly historic sources and crowdsourced from descendants of enslaved people, the project enables computational history, as well as traces the arc of individual lives through the scattered record that exists today. They do so by reusing data gathered by independent and family historians and combining it into a single cohesive narrative.
In our interviews with scientists, we learned about many different projects. For example, an agriculture project on potassium and phosphorus fertilizer recommendations pulls legacy data from soil studies to analyze how this data may have been used to generate fertilizer recommendations in the past. The data they're pulling about potassium and phosphorus levels within the soil do not always originate from studies focusing on these elements, but include these levels within their basic analyses. Another project on climate change is aggregating weather data from the International Comprehensive Ocean Atmosphere Dataset, ship logs, and weather waveband cards housed within various archives. With this data, researchers are conducting retrospective analysis to model past climates and generate a more cohesive picture of weather history.
So now let's go through some examples of various data recovery practices and processes that we're seeing in these studies. As you'll see, we're exploring a very wide range of practices, from formalized and scalable data conversion workflows to highly manual practices of lone scientists. These are all aimed at pulling data from archival sources for reuse in new contexts. The Lakeland project, for example, relies on community digitization days and oral history capture as the Lakeland community gathers info from its own members, and then implements a process of conversion into a database of metadata and digital objects. The enslaved.org project, on the other hand, gathers data from individuals and organizations who have meticulously combed through archives to gather data from records into spreadsheets, sometimes over the course of many years. Through a data submission process, independent submitters collaboratively map their data into the enslaved.org ontology. Simultaneously, they can submit data articles to the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, which is the journal linked to enslaved.org, for peer review.
In the sciences, we're seeing a similarly wide range of processes. The agriculture project is gleaning data on soil potassium and phosphorus levels from gray and pure literature, which entails manually transcribing tabular and plot data from old conference publications and information from handwritten notes. In the climate change project, on the other hand, researchers identified and collated data sources, digitized paper records, used crowdsourcing to transcribe the weather data, and added this information to weather databases. These researchers have also worked to identify and correct biases in the weather data by accounting for ship factors, and filled in data gaps by modeling sea temperatures at night in order to develop a broader picture of weather history. These examples include a really diverse set of practices to generalize across. So why is it worth looking across these different contexts? We are finding that these wide-ranging grassroots data recovery initiatives often face common challenges.
In our study, challenges include things like declining support from host institutions, shifting public support for and political interest in the topics of each project, technical considerations, and the capacity of the archive and their team for necessary change over time.
Recurring challenges identified by scientists conducting data recovery work include collections access issues associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, digitization and data sharing challenges associated with file formats and crowdsourcing platforms, the development of curation practices that ensure future usability of data, human factors specific to disciplinary attitudes, which may see data as better and include lacking inclinations to share data. And lastly, trouble securing funding, time, and resources.
While the question of how to sustain grassroots efforts can only meaningfully be answered around context-specific ways, there are factors all of these efforts have in common. So our ongoing work is identifying what it means to different communities to be successful, to complete a project, and to sustain their scholarly contributions and their communities over time.
We are also exploring models for equitable and ethical partnership between curators and communities, and other implications for practicing archivists, for librarians, for data curators, and for cultural and academic institutions. These projects are ongoing, both entering the stage of analysis, so we'll look forward to sharing more about each of these themes in the coming year. Thank you all for your time, and please do get in touch with us if you want to discuss any of these projects or to take part in them.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diana Marsh. I'm an assistant professor of archives and digital curation here at the iSchool.
And I'm Lydia Curlis, a PhD student and member of the Nipmuc tribe.
And today we'll be talking about a project to indigenize SNAC, social networks and archival context for Indigenous access to colonially held collections.
So GLAM institutions hold invaluable cultural materials and collections for Indigenous communities' reclamation of their languages, cultures, and histories. The archival diaspora caused by histories of colonial knowledge extraction has led to a lack of access for these communities. As well, bias in archival description and archival representation, a relic of colonial power and knowledge systems, often underrepresents and or misrepresents many marginalized and non-white communities. Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous ontologies, and growing literature on community-based archives has brought attention to these issues. As well, while NAGPRA exists to protect certain museum objects and collections, no such policy exists for archives.
The relationship between Indigenous communities and archives in policy and practice is also changing. The protocols for Native American archival materials, first published in 2006, were formally adopted by the Society of American Archivists in 2018, making ethical stewardship of Indigenous collections a mandate for all American archivists. SAA also just recently approved a repatriation committee to explore policy around the physical return of documents. There's been a similar process at the International Council on Archives and the release of a recent reconciliation framework 5 years in the making from our Canadian colleagues, which we'll hear about in an AERI panel tomorrow. In practice, we're also seeing lots of collaborative projects and tribal archives building, and importantly, new technologies are allowing reparative description to happen on a larger scale and in systems that can apply culturally appropriate unified terminologies. Next slide. So what is SNAC? SNAC allows searching people, organizations, and families across institutions and uses authority control and the EAC-CPF standard to accomplish that. It was designed to address the challenge of archival diaspora for all collections via a quote-unquote social document network. Next slide. Potentially, SNAC offers a number of important departures from quote-unquote traditional archival description that might benefit Native and Indigenous community discovery and access. As for all collections, it's that ability to connect geographically, or in this case, colonially separated records. It accommodates descriptive flexibility. SNAC allows editors to create new authorities essentially at will, and then to link those authorities to relevant archival collections around the world. That in turn may allow for the focus on Indigenous peoples, communities, and entities represented in collections that are often hierarchically organized by or held within the collections of a white collector or creator. And lastly, SNAC allows for Indigenous community members and allies to be trained and work as editors through a cooperative model. So people who know the content, understand its complexity, and attendant ethical standards can be the ones editing and creating records. Next slide. Based on a successful 2020 editathon led by Irene Gates and Catherine Satriano, focused on anthropologist papers, our team worked with an Indigenous advisory board who co-developed and designed a community-driven event through a 6-month process. And here's our whole team. Next slide.
So in our initial email for recruitment, we indicated the following goals. These goals were developed in alignment with our advisory board and really the broader consideration for what we were trying to attempt to do with this project. So our first goal was to facilitate discovery of archival materials that had been dispersed to multiple repositories and connect them to related communities. This was also related to our third goal of connecting through community collaborations. Our second goal was to create more and fuller records for Indigenous peoples and their histories and utilize decolonizing methodologies to create more accurate records, especially drawing upon communities' own knowledges. Our fourth goal was to develop recommendations, protocols, and best practices for SNAC to better represent and accurately describe Indigenous records. We also used feedback from participants to inform what affordances SNAC would need to make to accommodate Indigenous records. Our final goal was to create community capacity building through training more Indigenous SNAC editors. This was in part to address concerns of the advisory board in creating a sustainability for this work. So through this event, we were able to increase the number of Indigenous entities as well as Indigenous editors and allies. We were also able to increase awareness of the potential for SNAC through recruitment and reaching out to Tibbos and community contacts, making this platform and these archives more visible to these communities. Another outcome was the creation of the editorial guide for describing Indigenous entities in SNAC. This editorial guide draws upon the elements of Indigenous style, the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, and the protocols for Native American archival materials, as well as other sources that provide guidance on each of the SNAC fields. This guide was the most self-reported used document by participants and is currently a proposed draft to become policy for SNAC. However, there were some concerns that were raised among participants as well as from our advisory board. These concerns centered around describing Indigenous entities and greater awareness of the issues around Indigenous description in the archival record. Participant feedback showed concerns over adding things like location, nationality, and other fields to records. Challenges around describing Indigenous languages was very common, and many had concern, many of these concerns had originally been raised by our advisory board.
So this was a pilot. We have a kind of three-pronged approach to future work. First, we want to follow threads in collaborative and technical approaches to description work, to update the editorial guide as a living document, developing best practices for describing Indigenous content and metadata fields as a public-facing, shareable resource on how to do this work ethically. And we want to work with SNAC's technical developers, adopting controlled vocabularies and a wider array of cultural technical upgrades, which we hope might include Indigenous thesaurus, subjects, place names, languages, and orthographies. Second, we're exploring various grant opportunities, including a submission to IMLS, which would allow us to do more grounded testing and development of SNAC with Indigenous users from a range of perspectives. And lastly, regardless of funding, we want to pursue more community outreach, doing presentations in tribal archives, libraries, museums, and community centers. Last slide. So thank you to everyone who participated and supported this project, including especially our co-leads, Irene and Catherine, Dina and Jerry, SNAC liaisons at NARA, who went above and beyond to make the event happen, Daniel Pitty, director of SNAC, additional SNAC members who volunteered to help run and moderate and peer review for our event, all of our participants, UMD School, who funded honoraria, and of course, our advisory board, who worked tirelessly over many meetings to carry out the project. Thanks so much.
There we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Mason Jones. I'm a PhD student at the University of Maryland's iSchool and a member of Rad Lab. I'm here to talk a little bit about my current crowdsourced data reuse project. Crowdsourcing projects for libraries and archives have evolved significantly over the past decade. Institutional or research teams have created established norms and published research about successful crowdsourcing operations. A budding concern among researchers and practitioners alike is what could be done with the data after it's produced. The Rosa Parks Records Mapping Project, a project I'm working on in collaboration with my advisor, Dr. Victoria Van Heining, aims to create a crowdsourced data reuse case study using real records and crowdsourced transcriptions as a foundation for an interactive digital humanities project reusing crowdsourced data. Next slide. Before digging into the project, it's important to lay some groundwork about where the data are coming from and what the historical significance of this work is. Rosa Parks, made famous for her resistance and political activism in Montgomery, Alabama, kept detailed records of her time during the 1955-56 in organizing and boycotting racist Montgomery busing system and other social injustices. Parks kept detailed accounts of her experiences in the Jim Crow South, including significant people, places, events, as well as her own political and religious thoughts and philosophies. Her papers offer a deeper, more personal insight into her life and the organization of one of the most significant historical boycotts in American history. The historical research in this project is informed by primary sources from Parks herself, as well as other records, and the biographical work, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks by Jeannie Theo Harris. Next slide. These records were inherited by Parks's family after her death in 2005 and were eventually auctioned off to the Howard G. Buffett Foundation in 2014. The Buffett Foundation then loaned these records to the Library of Congress on a loan for 10 years. Upon receiving these documents, the Library of Congress digitized the records and crowdsourced transcriptions through the By the People crowdsourcing project, which invited volunteers to transcribe these records, also marking some of the first outside engagement with these personal documents ever. The library then made the transcriptions available to the public. Though these personal records and their corresponding transcriptions offer many options for reuse, what stuck out to me in an assessment of the transcriptions was the paired name location data for many of those involved in the bus boycott or other related civil rights activism. These data inspired the creation of the Rosa Parks Records Mapping Project. Next slide. Rosa Parks' personal records were initially created for her own use. They were documentations which not only included relevant information to her political activism, but also birthdays, wedding dates, her personal thoughts on religious sermons, and her thoughts on racial justice. As is with many personal documents, Parks' records are not created with future historical usage in mind, and especially not with crowdsourcing and discovery and the way the Library of Congress used them. In this case, I found gaps where otherwise name and address information is obscured, incomplete, or entirely missing. Still, these names and addresses are kept in several places in her records and set a precedent for their form, occasionally including phone numbers or additional information about the person's role in the boycott or the community at large. Next slide. The initial problem faced by this project was the collation and wrangling of available name and location data from Parks's personal documents from 1955 to 1956. Through the addition of other sources contemporary to Parks, I've been able to match names in Parks's record with related geolocation data, addresses, other location markers to create a more complete data set. These name location pairs are mappable through ArcGIS software and will eventually be ported over to an ArcGIS story map. The ArcGIS story map will include the full data set in an open form for anyone to access. And this project will open further for community members to recommend additional information, submit clarifications, and build out the project as a community. The intention of this work is not to always be a small team reuse project, but hopefully one which evolves and involves communities with ties or interests in civil rights, protests, social justice in the United States, or other contemporary or historical points of interest. Next slide. Reusing crowdsourced data in this way demonstrates the value of producing and making accessible new ways of engaging with archival records. Crowdsourced cultural heritage data provide opportunities for researchers, practitioners, digital humanists to build and evolve historical data into unique and engaging forms for the use of academics, the broader public. Crowdsourcing work continues to allow institutions to engage their public, to invite them into a new kind of cultural heritage experience, and to give back to them with accessible and fascinating ways of approaching the past. As crowdsourcing work continues to look towards the future, the ways in which these data are utilized will be significant in understanding how crowdsourced data might be further used and can give practitioners and scholars alike an insight into how to manage those data for broad potential use cases. This project will be published online as an interactive story map, but I appreciate any communication about the project in its ongoing state. This project is fluid, it's community focused, and I appreciate questions, comments, anyone reaching out about it. Thank you.
Okay, Hey everyone, my name is Travis Wagner. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Rad Lab and the Center for Archival Futures, and I'm going to be talking to you about utilizing information practices of ICT-based LGBTQIA+ archive content creators to facilitate inclusive content description. That's so many words, I'm going to unpack what they mean very shortly. Next slide, please. And in order to do that, I'm going to sort of talk to you about LGBTQIA+ identities or queer identities in historical relationship to archival data, and think about the already existing community resilient information practices done by queer communities in order to confront things like cisnormativity and heteronormativity, and in particular, explore the role of information and communication technologies in that work, and then sort of discuss an ongoing research project that involves ICTs being used to create queer-focused digital archives, and then briefly reflect on emergent findings related to that research. Next slide, please. So I want to have a couple of notes on terminology before we get started. First, when I use queer, I mean that to sort of represent the complex ways that LGBTQIA+ identities intersect and overlap with each other and are constantly evolving. But I also mean queer in the sort of political and theoretical sense that it is a praxis aimed at challenging and undermining normative presumptions. So in this context, right, what is good archival practice, or sort of what is archive worthy, thinking about undoing and challenging those notions. Next slide. And I'm also thinking about ICTs, or information communication technologies, as those sort of ways that we change and shift our relationships to technologies in our daily lives. The example I always use is in the 1995 Sandra Bullock film, The Net, where she sort of orders a pizza off of the internet, and it seems like this novel and wild thing. And now today it seems so common in practice. It's that sort of relationship to technology and how we do it, and how I'm thinking about that in relationship to ICTs. Next, please. So taking that sort of context, when I think about queerness in the archival record, it's important for us to understand that queer bodies and queer identities have historically been surveilled and regulated inside of archives, right? And extended beyond this, the sort of way that we describe and sort of represent queerness in archives and in information spaces tends to not be great. It sort of reproduces binaries and essentialized identities as informed by information organization frameworks. This means that queer communities tend to engage in archival work outside of or against institutions, and often use descriptive archival data practices that prioritize community affirmation rather than necessarily worrying about the functionality of a traditional archive in a curatorial sense. And I also added this conversation, this idea of information practices borrowing from the work of Savalainen, to sort of note that we do information work on our day-to-day basis, even if it's not like a research paper, right? Sort of figuring out how we navigate the subway, how we're going to order things. That's sort of information work, right? And it's informed by how we live and exist in the world. And that means that for queer individuals, that can often lead to doing information work or doing information in a way that's queer affirming or anti-cis normative, challenging the assumption that everybody's gender matches their sex assigned at birth, or anti-heteronormative, right? Challenging the idea that everyone is heterosexual. And I want to sort of point out that information communication technologies are really central to this work, right? Lots of scholars have pointed out that, queer populations use social media, use ITC spaces to explore, imagine, and legitimize their identities, right? And they often create informational resources in these spaces to confirm and protect their communities. This is really prominent in health information research, things like trans populations creating guides for one another to avoid transphobic or even violent doctors. And it's sort of starting to emerge as a way of thinking about digital queer history making as well. So my current research is exploring a couple of questions. First, how do content creators who use ICTs curate LGBTQIA+ history, and how do they seek, share, and use information on that process? What unique relationships exist between the role of ICTs and the description and curation of archival data, again, with regards to queer-focused digital archives? And then finally, what role, if any, archive professionals can offer in preservation and curation of data produced by ICT-based archives. And in order to do that, I'm currently undertaking semi-structured interviews with content creators of these digital archives, talking to them about their sort of archives background, the information practices of content creation, and how they frame their work within and against institutional archives. I'm planning to do 30 interviews and look at digital archives and recruiting from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, websites, and blogs, and hopefully TikTok as well. So I'll discuss some of my preliminary findings now. So first, what I've sort of found is that participants queer in that sort of sense that I gave you archival data practices. First off, as you might imagine, they understand archival description to be non-authoritative and a contentious process, right? Focusing on things like plural descriptions rather than a fixed essential description, saying that a person could be, say, a bush lesbian and a trans man, and not sort of seeing that as a contradictory, but a way that sort of identity can work. But data curation is also affective, right? A lot of times participants will say, well, I don't really look for it to sort of tell a historical narrative. Sometimes I want to curate around the idea of anger or rage, and I'll sort of pull materials out relational to that. And I think it really sort of challenges our assumptions of sort of objective curatorial work, right? And it also sort of is a practice emerging that sort of considers the images or the archival content to be of public value to queer identity, regardless of who owns or who the original creator of that is. This can include the creators sort of pulling things from behind paywalls and distributing them in their archives, or removing watermarks quite literally and saying, all right, now this is an image for our collection. And they sort of understand this sort of data production to be additive rather than proprietary. Participants sort of directly evoke queer theorists like Munoz talking about queer futurity and a sort of horizontal archival practice, but equally understand this to be sort of inherently political work. Next slide, please. And particularly, they sort of see the information communication technologies as sort of having curatorial affordances that might be absent elsewhere. Lots of folks who use Instagram talk about the stories function, allowing them not only to link to other similar collections, but sort of do fundraising work, advocacy, and community care alongside digital archiving. And they also utilize tagging as a sort of way to offer multiple perspectives and access points. Not a new finding, right? We've known that LGBTQ folks have used this on Tumblr and things like that. But in this sort of curated historical context, it's really, really fascinating. And also they sort of talk about having this sort of immediate feedback loop and communication with their sort of content, so users can sort of adapt and add to the project, right? It might echo some of that discussion of crowdsourcing here in really interesting ways. And in terms of how they understand the relationship archivist, right? Much like any community archivist, a lot of these born digital collections get picked up and people are like, oh, well, I have things I want to give to you that are physical. Will you keep them for me? And they're like, no, we don't do that, right? So understanding that there might still be a role for institutional archives to do that, but being equally aware that things like web archiving are really important to the work that they do, even if they don't know how to do it per se. What they sort of expressed having needs around weren't necessarily archival praxis, but having help navigating existing archival collections, getting over paywalls, locating quote hidden collections, or digitizing obsolete formats. But most important of all, they sort of want the sort of traditional or institutional archives to acknowledge the legitimacy of their archival work, even if it is quote unquote non-traditional. And this sort of tells me a couple of implications, right? First, that archives can explore collaborative potentials for data use across ICTs. And this primarily, and this speaks from the participants, requires, however, centering the voices and practices of LGBTQIA+ persons. But we can also see the sort of value of digital consortia. I'm thinking of the Digital Transgender Archive here as being a sort of way to sort of cross that curatorial work. But queer archives also produce new content alongside content curation. And again, it sort of tells us that we need to be reinvesting in thinking about the sort of challenges of born digital data curation, particularly with this community and these set of practices, while also sort of understanding that these populations are emphasizing the provision of additional information that isn't necessarily historical in context, right? Discussions about saying, I also raise this issue of political concern or sort of community concern that isn't historical narrative, but matters right this moment. But finally, sort of the implication here being that ICT content creators still look to archivists and information professionals for guidance on standardization practices, right? One participant sort of said, it helps that I have a friendly gay librarian to sort of help me through. So those are generally the implications so far. Like everyone else, happy to have a conversation about specific questions, but I'll end there. And I think we turn it over to Dr. Becker now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for these presentations and for inviting me to respond. It's a privilege. There's so much wonderful work here, and each project has many intriguing and overlapping facets. One reason I find the first study about across digital humanities and sciences so intriguing is that it raises many interesting questions about the nature of sustainability and what it means to sustain something, and the relationships between institutions and communities. I really enjoyed hearing about the project to indigenize snack because I find that it really demonstrates respectful and responsible partnerships and maybe charts a way towards some of these collections to be no longer colonially held at some point. I found the Rosa Parks project fascinating for its meshing of community work and crowdsourcing, and how it illustrates, in my view, how tricky it is to measure when or how a project is a success. And I really appreciate the Queer Archives project also because it speaks to some of the tensions that I've grappled with in my own work between the potential of ICT to support social change towards more inclusive, just and sustainable societies, and the unfortunate realities of dominant ICT practices and artifacts. And so I'd like to start by saying just a bit more about this tension and one way I like to think about it nowadays. And please feel free to leave comments and thoughts and questions in the chat too, and we'll hopefully return a little bit to these at the end. So on the one hand, ICTs do have wonderful potential. They support open information access, broader participation, and to some degree, which is interesting for me, the decoupling between economic and social activity and its material environmental impact. And so, for example, right now, they allow us to hold AERI virtually, safely, equitably, at low cost, and with flexible options for participation from anywhere, from a community that is broader than it would be if participation required travel and care and visas and financial resources and the right passport. And doing so comes at a much lower carbon footprint, material footprint than any other conference arrangement could. Recent studies showed that virtual conferencing reduces the carbon footprint of conferences by over 90%. And on the other hand, ICTs are heavily material, and more importantly, I think, are implicated in all sorts of destructive practices, from the deep sea mining that would never be possible without computing, to the social and environmental damages caused by the Ubers and Amazons and Airbnbs and ICEs of the world. And so the reality of dominant ICT practice does not look pretty. And so in my work, I've grappled with the question of how we can reorient computing and ICT to be more of a force for sustainability and justice. And through that work, which I've done largely in computing, I've struggled with just how strong the hegemonic patterns and belief systems are that prevent ICT work very often to genuinely contribute to these values. There's a lot of goodwill in many communities, but very often the results simply reinforce unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and exploitation. And so apart from the obvious elephant of fossil-fueled colonial capitalism, what I find is that the way that computing very often thinks rationally, objectively, scientifically, impersonally is, and this is unsurprising probably for all of you, is simply incapable of addressing the social and political nature of what it does. And one of the symptoms of these ways of thinking is the rampant solutionism, or the widespread belief that technology is just a neutral tool, and so on. And of course, it is never neutral. But across many of these communities, there are inspiring examples in which communities design and use ICT responsibly, equitably, and sustainably. And most of the time, I find this takes place when ICT is designed and used based on principles. They're not computing or technical principles, but principles such as design justice or commons or community work or decolonizing principles and so on. And when technology work is done on top of such foundations, ICTs can live up to their potential. And one concept that I found very helpful for me is this idea of the critical friendship. Now, some of you may have heard of that or may be familiar with it. It comes originally from pedagogy, where a critical friend on a more individual level brings support and profound respect to the table, but also enough distance to someone else to take a contrasting perspective and challenge the worldview of someone else. So a critical friend would ask questions that not just to reflect on our assumptions and our beliefs. One could say that critical friends are the friends who tells us what no one else dares to tell us because we wouldn't accept to hear it from someone else. And so that's very important for a critical friend's advice to be valued. For a critical friendship to work, the recipient also has to listen and value that constructive critique. It's a two-way relationship. And so I'm very interested in projects in which disciplines and communities that I consider potential critical friends, especially of computing work, do work with ICT and potentially speak to ICT and computing and how they do that. And that's where I find where some of the most interesting and exciting interdisciplinary work takes place, where we don't just use the insights or tools of one discipline to further the interests of another, but engage in a mutual constructive dialogue. And so for myself, the critical friends I've worked with are essentially feminist science and technology studies and a branch of systems thinking that is called critical systems thinking. And those insights help computing, especially specific computing fields, to reflect and to understand how their technical work is always also social and political work. And I think in some sense, the projects that you've presented could show some ways in which archival studies could also be a critical friend of ICT and maybe help to reorient ICT for values such as sustainability or justice. And maybe some of the questions I want to raise point in that direction. In the first presentation, Alia and Amanda spoke about the sustainability of scholarship. So in sustainability and in sustainability science, the first question always is, so what exactly is meant to be sustained? Are we talking about sustaining an ecosystem or a community or the current climate conditions of the planet or a company? And there's a very interesting question in answering that, but also there's an interesting spectrum of institutions, communities, and grassroots efforts and the relationships between these in these studies. And I find there is a really intriguing contrast between the two spheres that you look at, the digital humanities and the sciences. And maybe this is partially driven by the framing of the studies, but it almost seems as the science participants tend to look backwards to reuse, while the digital humanities communities look more forward to sustaining projects within communities instead of within institutions. And so the thing is that by definition, a project is something that has a defined end. And the digital humanities participants, if I recall correctly, see sustaining the artifact as actually useless without the community. And that's similar to other cases that I've seen. So the question maybe is, after the project ends, what is being sustained? And maybe Alia could, or Amanda could comment on that a bit.
Yeah, I think that depends on exactly which project we're talking about. The two case studies, at least on my end, that we talked a little more in detail about, kind of have different views on this. The enslaved.org project, for example, is a project that works to establish new ways of talking about historical events or talking about the histories and experiences of enslaved people and their descendants. So for them, when inevitably the actual contribution to the project ends, they seem to hope that the information that came out of it is what remains, that people have access to that kind of information and to those stories, and that the narrative around enslaved people is changed to one that's more historically accurate and more detailed and has a lot of those gaps filled in. But for the Lakeland project, everything that they have been doing with this archive is to help sustain the community itself. So the archive and the community are very closely intertwined. We had multiple participants actually directly say that there was no point of having an archive if the community is not sustainable. And so for that one, they are specifically working to sustain the actual community. And a lot of them believe that if they were to reach a point where the archive has helped the community become sustainable without the need of the archive, that the archive could just go, that it will have done, like, completed its purpose. Oh,
That's
Amanda.
so interesting. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying, Amanda, if you have anything to add to that.
So yeah, thinking back to our interviews with scientists, in our interviews, I mean, they're reflecting on data rescue projects that they've been a part of, but they're also thinking about the potential reuse of materials that are unanticipated. Yeah, they're interested in connecting like historical data to contemporary data and to understand long-term phenomena. And yeah, they might not always know when they're doing reuse what that might look like. So yeah, our team is interested in, when thinking about like what is being sustained, our team is interested in leveraging the conclusions generated from this project to ongoing efforts aimed at making tools and resources available in order to support scientific data accessibility and use, like the potentials for reuse in the future. And thinking about this question, I was thinking about how the scientists and the curators that we talked to would respond, and I'd imagine that they'd respond saying that they hope that data is being sustained and data sharing practices to support the potentials for reuse are being sustained.
Excellent. Yes, this is really interesting. I think I was wondering if maybe, and it's just a thought, is that maybe it would be interesting to consider these fields or some of these sites through a commons lens. And when we look at commoning lenses, there is always this question about the relationship between those who act on maintaining the commons and those who benefit from the commons, and how these two and their timelines and time horizons and incentives are aligned or misaligned. And sometimes it's about designing the right kind of institution in the broadest sense to help align or balance their relationships. And maybe that will be an interesting lens for that. Right, and so then in the second presentation, for me, this really speaks very forcefully to questions of responsible partnerships. And when we first talked about these projects briefly last week, my immediate reaction was to ask whether Indigenous communities were involved and in charge of this project. I didn't have the full picture yet. And to me, the response was really inspiring. I felt like this is how it should be. And I thought maybe Lydia and Diana could comment a bit on what it could mean for these collections to eventually be no longer colonially held.
Yeah, I'll start. So I think that, like, obviously, like with projects like this, like the end goal, at least as far as I see it, is to connect communities back to their own knowledges so that they then can make the decisions about what they want to have happen to those knowledges. Oftentimes too, with Indigenous communities, this information lives in like anthropologist papers and colonial records and a lot of places that I'm very positive Indigenous people did not consent to having that information. So obviously this would be the first step, but I think that like long-term, there has to be ways to support Indigenous communities actually being able to hold on to those materials. And like what that might mean is joint stewardship and them remaining in some of these colonial institutions, but with different kinds of frameworks or ways of keeping them that are in line with what the Indigenous communities want. And knowing that each community, each group, each person is going to be very different. And so that there is going to be some kind of give and take between the relationship between the institution and the community.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the physical repatriation of archival material is still not commonly accepted by most archival professionals or institutions. I think that's slowly changing. And obviously it depends on the format, you know, like most people don't actually want old audio, you know, Travis was just talking about like, you know, outdated material, like in those collections, a digital copy that's high resolution is, you know, fine, right? But in some cases, communities do want physical drawings or notebooks or language materials back at home. And I think that's something that, you know, if it helps to know where the material is in the first place, which is the thing that this project kind of helps, you know, fill that gap. But we've got a lot of work to do on the policy side, on the professional side, and kind of on the legal side to make it possible for that to happen.
Excellent. And then one question I kept thinking about when I heard about all these projects is, what really is success and when should we evaluate it? And that is one question that sustainability especially points to, because it challenges a bit how we commonly think about success. And I thought that Mason's project documents really interesting relationships between the institution, the volunteers, and the community. And crowdsourcing does not always work well, but there are patterns of success that we can learn from. And there are some very, very effective and very successful crowdsourcing projects. And so I wanted to pose two questions to Mason. One is, where do you see the threshold or the differentiation between community work and crowdsourcing in your project, in your case? And second, at what point do you know whether that project is a success?
Those are great questions. I think to your first point, considering the crowd versus community is a kind of very difficult and contentious line to walk in some ways. I'm benefiting from crowdsourcing that was done by the Library of Congress, where they organized individuals to come together and take part in this, to volunteer to create transcriptions from these personal documents. And in keeping with that, I'm hoping to create this project in a way that encourages community involvement. But how do I differentiate between the crowd and the community? To some extent, I take the community to kind of be a political entity in a sense, not in sort of a partisan or involvement in politics in that sense, but it's organizations or non-institutional groups of people coming together to accomplish some kind of task or to involve themselves in some kind of goal. And so I take the crowd to kind of be a community in that sense. It's a group of people that are brought together, whether artificially or by design, to participate in a certain action to achieve a certain goal, regardless of individual interests or ulterior motives. They're ideally participating together. And I see that carrying over in how I want this project to continue. After the data are cleaned, after the story map is completed and shared, my full intention is to involve a community, involve a group of interested parties to be a part of this process. And so that's actually bleeds into your second question very well, because I see success as achieving that community, whether the project enters into a form of completion or not. I believe it will be successful when individuals have come together and participated in it beyond the work that I'm doing to translate it from a Library of Congress transcription data to a reuse case in this project. That's how I see success.
Let me just interrupt the conversation quickly to say that we're at the hour. This is when our session is technically supposed to end, but some of our panelists are happy to stay on and continue the conversation. For those who need to run off to the next short paper session, please go ahead and do so. And I'll hand it back to you, Christoph.
Thanks. Yeah, so much to talk about. So yeah, I think this thanks Mason for those responses. I think this is really insightful, and I think the project is really a great illustration for me of the importance of expanding the time horizon, that we cannot decisively evaluate many projects on completion as it is often done, especially in kind of the IT industry setting. So if we are keen on evaluating success, we need to do that later, and we need to figure out what is an appropriate timescale. And that is, of course, always challenging. And so then in the fourth project, I was reminded of the design justice work of Sasha Constanza Chock and their example of airport scanners built on binary gender stereotypes. And I thought of how Bowker and Starr used this brilliant metaphor of the torque that technologies can exert, the twisting force that tends to cause rotation. So when gender stereotypes are baked into technological artifacts, they end up twisting and distorting the lives and identities of those who encounter these artifacts who do not conform to narrow categories. But on the other hand, with the right framing, the curatorial affordances offered by ICT can be empowering and can reconfigure some of the relationships between communities and institutions. And I thought it's also really interesting, this work, as a case of what my colleague Kostis Dallas called curation in the wild in an archival science article a few years ago. So curation beyond institutional frontiers, which I think is a really interesting aspect and points again to that relationship between community and institution. And so maybe, Travis, could you speak a bit more to that question of who should define what success and sustainability should look like in that particular community?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I absolutely, just for sake of time, I had a whole slide about that point of like body scanners and unnecessarily gendered things. So absolutely agree. with that. But every time I think I have a solid answer to this, like I interview another participant and they just keep sort of reframing this conversation. But I've been asking participants, like, what does a successful archive like yours look like, right? And I'll even be like, think of one that isn't yours. What does it look like? And all of them do not give me answers that are about like digital sustainability or, aren't about like, oh, I have good metadata. It's always about what is this doing to affirm and uplift my community in the contemporary moment, which I think is really, really important here. It really echoes what Alia was saying about the Lakeland community, right? It's like the function here is to do contemporary justice work, right? And if I do that, then I don't really care about sustainability. Like I had one participant, in fact, say, I don't anticipate my archive being sustainable, but I do anticipate it working to confirm an identity that needs to sort of deal with its presence in a historical moment, right? Understanding that like it's both saying we have existed in the past, but also we are fighting to sort of be present into the future, right? Like responding to very real, tangible legislation against their bodies, right? So success and sustainability here are secondary concerns to quite literally increasing access and sort of short-circuiting access between archives and institutions that they see for myriad reasons that they do and do not understand, making that access point difficult, right? So their job here is ultimately to sort of affirm to the community level and also sort of say, we're going to make things accessible that are otherwise not accessible. So that's sort of my broad answer to those questions.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. I think, and this relationship between questions of sustainability and justice, I think is also resonates very much with me. I just wanted to briefly mention something that I think is quite, that could speak to this, is that in sustainability, in kind of sustainability science and applying this, Morse and Bell grappled with this challenging of measuring the immeasurable, as they say in their subtitle, in the context of environmental sustainability and regional planning, which sounds like it's a completely different thing. But it's actually very interesting to see how they initially attempted to apply very conventional environmental science framings of what is sustainable, only to run up against these limitations of this purely science-driven, supposedly objective methodology. And they turned to soft systems thinking and argued for the importance of situated, community-defined measures of sustainability that take into account the scientific frameworks, but use community-defined indicators and pathways of measuring and responsibility. So it's really about community governance. And so in their framework, communities own that question of what is to be sustained, how do we measure success, and who gets to measure and when. And so I think that project resonates with that and speaks to this very well. Yeah, so across these projects, communities recreate and repurpose archives and their data using various forms of ICT. And I think there's many wonderful insights and promises in these projects. So thank you all very much for your insights and for inviting me. And I look forward to seeing where these projects go and where the RAD lab goes next. And I think maybe let's turn to the audience and head back to Katrina and Dan.
Yes, thank you so much, Christoph. A huge thank you to Christoph for serving as our discussant and bring continuity to all of these talks. I will invite the audience to ask questions. I don't know at this point how many of our audience are left since we ran over the hour, but I do see a few here. Yeah, so questions from the audience, please. Victoria.
Katrina, oh, sorry, hi.
Yeah, hi, please go
It's
ahead.
okay, I'll take bouncer's prerogative. So I had said earlier, folks, that I am also a member of the RAD Lab, but wasn't planning to be here today, and then I am here today. So anyway, I'm lurking and being a bouncer, but I wanted to circle back to Margaret's question in the chat about whether the Rosa Parks story map might be able to take in content from other databases and other sources. And when we set out doing this work at the beginning of the year, and Mason's been doing a lot of the legwork of the cleaning of the data, we didn't think super widely about other sources that might come in, except to sort of validate and expand what is in the diaries or the date books and other things themselves. But it's been really clear that, there are other, of course, really rich sources of information that would help illuminate the broader boycott struggle. And so other sources of information would be great. And as far as I understand, an ArcGIS map can take in all sorts of layers of information. Yeah, let's talk about it. Obviously, that was not a question. So if anybody has an actual question.
Am I allowed to ask Dr. Becker a question?
Yeah.
That's not the point, but I was actually curious because I'm wondering if like are there timescales for sort of evaluating success? I know I need to just read your book that you have seen like working, or do you have some sense of like in this, if it's this kind of thing, then you need 10 years, or if it's this kind of thing, or do you think there's sort of like a ballpark?
Oh, that is such a good question, and I will thoroughly disappoint. I definitely don't have a clear answer to that. It is completely context and domain specific. I'm thinking, so when one way that I think is very useful, which we have developed in this community around people concerned with the impact of IT on sustainability overall, is essentially inspired by system dynamics and ecological economics, which distinguishes between the immediate feature or characteristic of a technological artifact on the first level. On the second level, the enabling effect that it has on its surroundings. And on the third level, the high-level aggregate impact that this has. So for example, the immediate feature of Airbnb is that you can book stuff and it exists and it uses energy and there's labor that goes into it. So that's the life cycle impact, and there's whole disciplines of assessing that. The enabling effect means that people can travel differently and people can invest into properties differently. And now the fact that millions of people have traveled differently and hundreds of thousands or something like that number have invested differently means that the aggregate third level impact is that cities have changed, housing has become unaffordable in many metropolises, and travel has changed. And so that is, that is not about time at all, but in each of these domains, it takes a certain time for these aggregate impacts to be visible and predictable and felt. And so depending on what sort of domain that is, that should give you some idea on what sorts of timescales we're talking about. And so maybe in that sense, when you think about a community and archival resources, you could think a bit about what sort of key events and sequences or causal relations existed could possibly cause major changes, and what sort of, in system dynamics terms, what sort of reinforcing feedback loops exist that can amplify social change. So essentially, you don't get large-scale impact without reinforcing feedback loops. And so in the very specific system dynamics sense, this is one way of thinking through that. So if you can model those patterns in one particular area, domain, or site, then you should be able to get some idea of what timescale is appropriate. Similar to, and just to put an extreme example, you look at geodesic measurements of civil infrastructure, you clearly look at the impact of travel and weather events and climate on the erosion of materials. And clearly that is something for which you need almost, not geological, but you need large scale timescales, right? But if you look at something that is a new app that can be rapidly used and shape some very small behavior, then the impact could be felt very quickly. In the case of something like Airbnb, investment can be done relatively fast, but it does take at least months for any initial impact to be felt.
Yeah, I find that so interesting too. I know in kind of museum studies and visitor studies work, there's some scholarship on, going back to visitors who went to an exhibit, 60 years ago, and like doing these like extremely longitudinal analysis of like, what was the sort of community impact or memory impact of some of that work. And I don't know that folks have been doing that in these arenas that we're working in, but how interesting would that be? To think about what that would look like. And I'm thinking for Lydia, since we're looking at integrative paper and dissertation stuff eventually, we've talked about the protocols in archives for Native American archival materials. This is kind of like landmark event that you might actually now have enough time scale to look at what its impact has been. So that's potentially actually a possibility.
Yeah, I think there's something very interesting there in that you're facing a very specific conflict between the desire to finish a dissertation and the entire project within a certain time frame. Certainly, you don't want to wait 30 years to actually get the results for the thesis, right? But what maybe, and I'm just speculating here, what maybe could be interesting is to include a specific contribution that sets out the basis for a longitudinal evaluation much later. And the challenge there, of course, is that you then, if you try to publish this, you will get some reviewers who will say, well, there's no results here. And of course, the point is that the results is the framework set out. And yes, you cannot fully evaluate that yet. And that is the core challenge of these kinds of long distance, long-term impacts. And in that sense, there is this big parallel between sustainability and justice, is this distance that something we do now affects someone at a different place or time. And in the case of sustainability, it's the future. In the place of justice and social justice, it's often someone who is alive right now, but at a different place, in a different social role, in a different place of the matrix of oppression, so to say. And that distance creates ethical conflicts and ethical dilemmas and moral hazards about how we take decisions. And the framing of just sustainability helps to show these relationships between justice and sustainability.
Any final questions or comments? Dr. Becker, is there a link to pre-order your book?
Not yet, I think. I just actually put in a link to Agimann's book on just sustainabilities, which is really about the intersection of environmental sustainability and social justice and framing that just sustainabilities. No, but I just received some marketing copy, and so I think there will be a website up soon. And I will be sure to post the link on Twitter once it actually happens. So
I hope there'll be a stop on your book tour.
Yes, cafe.
We'd like to be a stop on your tour. Yeah.
Happily. Yeah, sometime next spring is the estimated schedule. Well, the schedule I was given.
Perfect. We're hosting a series of book talks, so that would be ideal. All right. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you to our discussant, Dr. Becker, and thank you to our audience members, especially those of you who stuck it out with us to the very end. Have a great rest of the conference.